In this video, we're going to be playing you an excerpt of a presentation I did regarding the Highland Lighthouse. Stick around. If you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. They are down below this video. We're going to play a little excerpt of a video presentation I did. It was recorded live in Brewster at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. The presentation focuses on the Highland Lighthouse and my ancestors, the Small family that worked that lighthouse. This is focused a little bit more on the early history, and I hope you'll enjoy this. This presentation was edited as the audio and video quality didn't quite work out the way we'd hoped, but I hope it gives you a little flavor of what the presentation was about and gives you some information that you'll find helpful. Here it is. What Boston Light was, welcoming ships in, coming to port, bring your goods, as opposed to what Highland Lighthouse became, which is a danger and with a unique signal to stay away because the banks off the lighthouse were dangerous and ships were actually being destroyed, unfortunately, out there. Truro at the Highland Lighthouse was known as Dangerfield, and that's what the mariners called it because they knew ships were making a wreck. They could see where the land was. They felt they were a safe distance away, but they weren't, unfortunately. But there were gales and bad storms. It would pull the ships in, and just that movement of the waves would crash them in along some of the sandy bars and the rocky areas outside. And it was in 1796, Congress appropriated $8,000 for the lighthouse to be built. It is Benjamin Lincoln, and he had written a letter, and it stated, because the lands here are pretty good and are not so sandy as to be liable to be blown away by the high gales of wind, too often experienced on the Cape, as the lighthouse must be made of wood, the soil will be good for the foundation. Fresh water can easily be obtained within the 10 acres. The land will summer a cow after a garden shall be taken off, for which there's some pretty good land. So he felt that was a pretty stable spot. I think relative to beach sand and soft soil, it was a good spot. But he's talking about it won't be blown away like this. And according to the geologist Barbara Chamberlain, these thick, rugged clay bluffs were laid down as glacial lake deposits during a quiet time, following a warming interglacial period that lasted about 50,000 years, and then were pumped up when the next advance of the glaciers moved through. So as these glaciers were coming through and settling, they were pushing this land up, and there's just an amazing geological structure that was formed from that. And that's all the land. It's about 55 acres. The lighthouse ended up purchasing 10. The government purchased 10 for the lighthouse to be built. And it was my great-great-great-grandfather, Isaac Small, who owned that 55 acres. Today, if you go to the lighthouse, you see the golf courses, you see the Highland House Museum, you see everything across the street. That was all owned by Isaac Small at that time. From the documentation I've seen, he was very happy to do this. He knew it needed to be put somewhere. He had the land, and he felt this would be a good thing. It would help save lives. So in 1796, that's when they began constructing the lighthouse. This is more of what it looked like as opposed to what we see today. This is my interpretation of reading documents of the lighthouse. It was an old 45-foot wooden structure. It was an octagonal shape. It was not the big cylindrical white lighthouse we see today. And this is part of an illustration, a drawing I'll be doing in charcoal. And I'll have, this is the top section of it. I'll have a picture of Isaac down here, as if he was standing outside of his lighthouse, getting his likeness with the lighthouse behind him taken. But that was about, at that time, 500 feet from that bluff. If you see today, that's eroded all the way through to that. And it's mostly eroding away because of the wind. It's really heavy winds out there, and as they scoop up off the ocean, they're hitting that sand that comes up, and they're just chewing away at it. And you can see that windy days. If you go up there, you'll see sand at the edge, just swirling and blowing around. And there's verbal tradition that this is the house. It's also known as Tashmiut. You can see the lighthouse up here. So if you walked away from the lighthouse and just cross over Highland Road, South Highland Street, you went behind that house. That was Isaac's house. It was built around 1760 or so, 1770, and that's where he lived. That was his main dwelling, and he would walk every day from there to, that's the location of the lighthouse at that time, that old wooden structure. And it's called Tashmiut in a lot of the records, and that's an Indian word meaning place of many springs. So it was on November 15th, 1797, that Isaac Small, at sunset, climbed the 45-foot octagonal wooden lighthouse, and he lit the 15 spider lamps. And that was the first night on record that the lighthouse went into service. Like, they were filled with whale oil. It was just wicks sticking out of these little canisters, and they had to trim those wicks really tightly every night and throughout the night, because if the wicks got too long, they wouldn't burn as bright, and they needed this lighthouse to really be burning a lot of light to emanate out to the ocean, especially on the foggy nights. And some of the keepers' duties begin with wicks, and they had to polish the reflectors. Anything that emanate from these pieces, any of that glass, they all developed a lot of soot, so that had to be wiped clean, as well as all the glass enclosure that the light was in. If that built up soot, it was dimming that light. You have to remember, the light that's emanating, pitch black out there. There were no other lights around. Moths, bugs were all landing on the outside, and they were staying there. So the lighthouse keeper had to go outside, clean off the bugs from that, so it was going to actually project a little bit more, a little bit brighter. But unfortunately, a lot of the equipment was not working properly. So Isaac would go in there, and he would turn this large crank to get this mechanism, these gears, to start working, so this eclipser would go around it. It's supposed to wind it about once a night, maybe twice a night, and he found that there were issues with that, probably due to the salt air, corrosion and stuff, and he ended up needing to wind that several times a night. And as the machinery didn't run long, as it was supposed to on a single wind. Part of the reason Isaac was selected and appointed to the position of lighthouse keeper is that he owned this land. He owned the farm. He had money coming in. He was prosperous and self-sufficient. So they knew that they could have someone living on the premises, caring for himself and his family through other means than just a lighthouse salary. And it was Isaac was the lighthouse keeper from 1797 until 1812, so a good span of 15 years, and that's when Constant Hopkins succeeded Isaac. And by the time you get to the 1820s, the wooden lighthouse had sustained so much damage over the years. You can imagine being out on the coast, that salt air coming through. They didn't have preserved wood back then. They just repaired what they needed to. And it was quoted or stated in the 1797 tower was in such poor condition, wretchedly constructed and very imperfect. It is easily racked by the winds, which shakes the lantern so much as to break the glass very frequently, according to the local lighthouse superintendent. So it was in about 1843 that Isaac's son, he had several children, but Isaac's son, James Small, took on the role as a lighthouse keeper. And he did that in two phases until 1849, and then again in 1853 until 56. Sometimes lighthouse keepers were just hard to come by. People didn't want the position. They didn't want to be away from their family. You're up on a tower every night. Wind, rain, no matter what the weather is, especially needed up there in the storms. So people have responsibilities. They have their own farms to take care of. James Small was living on a property that he inherited from his father, Isaac. So he took on that position. And it was during that time that Henry David Thoreau was coming to Cape Cod. So he traveled different areas of Cape Cod, but he settled in North Truro, and he met with James Small and James' wife, Jerusha, during those visits. And he went on to stay the Highland Lighthouse, which we were staying is a substantial looking building, a brick painted white and surmounted by the iron cap. Attached to it is the dwelling of the keeper, 1 story high, also of brick and built by government. As we were going to spend the night in the lighthouse, we wished to make the most of so novel an experience, and therefore I told our host that we would like to accompany him when he went to light up. And also in his book, Cape Cod, Thoreau also wrote, "The keeper entertained us handsomely in his solitary little ocean house. He was a man of singular patience and intelligence, who, when our queries struck him, rang as clear as a bell in response. The lighthouse lamp, a few feet distant, shone full into my chamber and made it bright as day, so I knew exactly how the Highland Light bore all that night." And it was a very bright beacon, and Thoreau got to experience that. Now James had a son who was very young when Henry David Thoreau visited his parents, but this is years later in Isaac's book. Isaac did a lot of writing about his memories of Cape Cod, his experiences, but he wrote several books, Cape Cod, more Cape Cod stories. And he had another book, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, which he observed. He was a marine reporting agent for about 70 plus years. He lived to the age of 88, so he was very active. If you've ever been to the Highland Museum, that was previously the Highland Hotel. And he and his wife Lillian owned that hotel from around 1900 to the 1930s. And my dad, born in 1913, used to go and visit them with his parents at the hotel. So I have photographs in our personal family records of my dad as a young boy and Isaac and his wife in the group family photo next to them. Isaac writes, "Thoreau made his first journey down the Cape in 1849. At that time, my father, James Small, was the keeper of Highland Light. I, a kid of 4 years old, thought him, Thoreau, quite a wonderful man. I remember he was a man that required but little sleep. He would sit up until 11 o'clock or after, and then be up the next morning at 4 a.m. He would sit 2 or 3 hours on the edge of the cliff watching the passing boats and the seagulls. He did not desire a great quantity of food and was deeply interested in the natural changes that were going on." And Isaac also states, "Before his departure on the following morning, he gave me a full quire of white paper and 2 lead pencils. In those days, things of this kind were not plentiful, and naturally, I was kept greatly pleased. For the next few days, I was kept entirely out of mischief by drawing all kinds of houses and animals on paper." So, yeah, Thoreau had quite an impact on Isaac, and I think that shows through a lot of Isaac's writings years later. And it was in 1861, Thomas Small, who from my records appears to be the son of James Small, and the grandson of the first Isaac, the Lighthouse Keeper, was appointed as Lighthouse Keeper until 1866. So again, it stayed in the family. But there were many lighthouse keepers in between. It didn't significantly just stay in the family. The Small family lived in that area. It was convenient for family members to then apply for this. It was part of the family tradition at that time, and partly because they were right near the lighthouse, they could easily access it. All that land, all the buildings that were built out there were fully easy for them to access. And Thomas is the last generation of the Small family to officially hold that title of Lighthouse Keeper. And it was 1986, the Coast Guard automated and de-staffed the lighthouse. And the last Lighthouse Keeper was Patrick Punty, who lived in the station with his wife Catherine and 2 small children. And it was with the mid-90s and the continued erosion of the Highland cliff edge at the rate of at least 3 feet a year, it was determined that the lighthouse would need to be moved away from the edge or suffer the fate of falling into the ocean within a few years. It was reported in 1990 that 40 feet were lost just north of the lighthouse from the collapse of a section of the land. So you've probably seen this new LED, and that was installed in 2017. So it's different, you know, it's a flashing light. Yes, it's been a long time since any of my family worked in a lighthouse, but having that fascination, I'm an artist and illustrator, so I'm working on a children's book, and I figured what better place to have for the lighthouse and this little character to live in. So this is my book. Hopefully will be out next year, The Adventures of Thomas the Lighthouse Mouse. And that's him and his little friend Matilda, and they're observing the lighthouse and just excited to see that beacon. And they're probably going to live in and around the lighthouse and the Lighthouse Keeper's house over here, and maybe some of my other connections with family history, as I can get some records from that. and imagine the date that those were built, so get a better indication of the floorboards, areas that the mice might create their own little world in. And in the books there'll be trains, so there'll be parts of Truro history involved in this, and parts of my own family history, and hopefully imagination, and the adventures they go on will hopefully inspire new generations of.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up down below, and in the comments, let us know if you'd like to see more about lighthouses. You can just type yes, you can type in show me more about lighthouses. We'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you next time, and before you sign off, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And I also have art tutorial videos and a whole process of videos about my journey into decluttering. As you can see around me, I've got quite a few things, but if you could see in front of me, I have a lot more things. So I'm going to have videos about decluttering and organizing spaces and living more peacefully. So tune in, subscribe, and I will see you all soon. Bye.